where Courtland Sutton is, I use the air quotes, holding out. You can't hold out from voluntary workouts. I get that. But teams look at it that way, despite the fact the Broncos have said, George Paton said that Sutton's in a good place. They're not worried about it until mandatory minicamp next month. I get that. But you talk about weapons, and here's what they had. Sutton led the team in receiving yards with 772. He led the team in touchdowns with 10. He was
there
actually
a team
near the league leaders in touchdowns.
Had a pass yardage leader in receptions that was below 772.
In this day and age?
I'm not sure there was. New England comes to mind as a possibility.
For sure.
Maybe New England.
And obviously the situation with Russell Wilson, that just did not work out.
And we know they haven't had a 1,000-yard receiver in almost as long a period of time as they've been going without a 1,000-yard running back.
But you go and look at that, Sandy. How about this? 28 receivers last year had more than 1,000 yards. 28.
And the Broncos didn't even have an 800-yard receiver.
No. As a matter of fact, Courtland Sutton, 772, comes in between Jacksonville's Christian Kirk and Indy's Josh Downs for
neither a number
most,
one receiver.
44th most in the league.
That's your leading receiver.
Yards. Now, to be fair,
that's why he's not getting a big contract from the Broncos or probably from anybody else. The guaranteed money with Sutton is the whole issue. And I suppose the Broncos and Sutton could settle up on that. But prior to the mandatory minicamp, which is, 2 weeks away, approximately?
Almost exactly. Yeah, it's the 11th. So, yeah, just a little bit.
I don't see it, do you?
No. And
without it, I don't see him appearing.
Right. And the weird part is I don't see incentive for either party to budge. That's the complicated part, right? Courtland Sutton has 2 years remaining on his contract, $35.1 million remaining. As we tell you every time with NFL contracts, ignore that because NFL contracts are not guaranteed like every other sport. So he only has $2 million of those $35 million guaranteed. So if you're Courtland Sutton, I get it. 44th in the league in receiving is not all that impressive, but tied for 4th in the league in touchdown receptions is, especially from an offense that was not particularly
But the quarterback who threw him those passes isn't here anymore.
No, he is not. And now
he's not working out, and I know he doesn't have to, but he's not working out, and I guarantee he can say anything he wants. Sean Payton knows this and has been through it before with Michael Thomas in New Orleans. Two guys who were once very close, who, because of contract finagling, negotiations gone awry, became less than close, a lot less close than they had been before.
And again, Sutton is not a Sean Payton guy. We talked about that yesterday as well. Payton likes the people that he brought in, that he knows how to work with.
The Broncos have traded away Courtland Sutton's guys.
Right.
Two of them, one being Justin Simmons, who's been here for longer or had been here for even longer than Sutton had been here. And the other, of course, is Russell Wilson, who played for 2 years here and now is in Pittsburgh.
How about this challenge? Because I'm inclined to believe that Courtland Sutton would like to move on. He's been on a losing team for his whole career.
I think it is safe to surmise
he's bouncing around with quarterbacks. He'd like to go. Now, he can't get a massive increase, but the Broncos have no incentive to give it to him because, as you pointed out, he was barely in the top 50 in receiving, although the touchdowns are great. And if you're the Broncos, you look at it and say, well, if you hit all your benchmarks, you're going to make $35 million. So why do we need to give you a bump? So neither side has room to give entirely. Here's where the Broncos might. If Sutton does not report, if he's not with the team for any reason, here's the remaining performance numbers for the guys left. Josh Reynolds, the new addition from Detroit, had 608 yards last year and 5 touchdowns. Marvin Mims, returning rookie, a second-year player, 377 yards and a touchdown. Brandon Johnson, 284 yards and 4 touchdowns, second on the team, by the way. Little Jordan Humphrey, 162 yards and 3 touchdowns. If you were doing the math a little more quickly than I was, that means the remaining total yards last year, minus Courtland Sutton, for the wide receiving core with Jerry Jeudy out, 1,431. Total. Now, Tim Patrick is Supposed to come back. He was injured last year. You have 2 receivers that are rookies in.
But Tim Patrick hasn't played in 2 years.
In 2 years.
In 2 years.
And you and I believe when you look at his contract that he's actually a bit of a long shot to make the team. He's not a Sean Payton guy. He hasn't played in 2 years. Peyton keeps bringing in guys like Philip Dorsett or David Sills, guys that he's a little more familiar with. I think Patrick's a long shot to make the team at all. But obviously, if you're Tim Patrick, you had to sign something so you can get out there and practice and show people you're healthy again and maybe land another gig. But I think the Broncos will move on. But they just don't have a lot there. You're really counting on Troy Franklin and maybe even Devon Vielda to step up and as rookies and be really good. I know they're counting on Franklin, and they should. But this team doesn't have all that much. Mims is undersized. Is he talented? Yes. Can you flat use him as a guy on the outside for most of your snaps? Not really. Franklin, as a collegiate player, has decent size, but was used primarily on the inside where he did the majority of his work. Now, that's a Peyton thing. He's going to be happy with that. He's happy that Nix has that kind of rapport with him. But if they don't re-sign Courtland Sutton, how comfortable are you with going realistically as your outside receivers? Realistically. Either Reynolds and Franklin or Reynolds and Brandon Johnson. That's what you'd be handing your rookie quarterback.
Well,
you might need to figure out something with Courtland Sutton.
I like the selection of Troy Franklin on the 4th round. If you think, as Dana Brugler of The Athletic does, that he's one of the top 12 receivers who came out for this particular draft and drafted. I don't know how many receivers ended up getting drafted as 35, 36, 37, something like that. I like the fact that they got the kid from Utah in the 7th round. He's not nearly as highly rated as Franklin, but, nice pick on the 7th round. You're telling me they're going to be leaning to some degree on 2 rookies drafted in the 4th and 7th round. I understand that the guy picked on the 4th round has played with Bo Nix, and no one else among the receivers can make that claim, obviously.
Yeah, that's a big advantage for him.
It's just so unsettled and uncertain. And I know there are people out there. I don't talk to as many of those people as you do, Sean, but there are people out there who say, in Bo, we trust. But even more significantly, at least in their minds, in Sean Payton, we trust. Sean Payton is a quarterback whisperer. He is an offensive play-calling genius. We didn't see necessarily much evidence of that last year, but I think fairly or unfairly, and I would say more unfairly than fairly, Russell Wilson took the rap for that.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
So now the scapegoat is gone, and we see how creative, how skillful Sean Payton remains as a play caller who was once great, but that was a long time ago when he was considered a great play caller in a way that made more difference than almost anything else. The player is always more important than the coach.
Right.
So Drew Brees, I think, had more to do with New Orleans' offensive success than Sean Payton. They had a special relationship. There's no doubt about that. And the best news about the Bo Nix selection is that even now that same relationship seems to be developing at a rather rapid pace with respect to Bo Nix and his head coach, Sean Payton. That's the best news.
Yeah, it is the best
worst
news.
News is you've got to have somebody to throw the ball to. And I don't know that they have, as you have suggested, anyone who is established. And even the player who is, Courtland Sutton, assuming he reports, was probably not one of the best 35 receivers, one of the best 36 receivers in the NFL last year by any reasonable measure.
Unless you count touchdowns, and a lot of people do look at that as some sort of, dividing line.
Well, to me, I don't know that that's been an annual feature of Sutton's game.
No, as a matter of fact, in the last
it sort
4
of jumps out
years,
as an outlier.
4 years, he has a total of 10 touchdowns. Prior to last year.
Last year.
Right. In fact, he had 14 career touchdown catches, coming into last year, and had 10 last year. So it's fair to probably look at that and say that's anomalous. Now, you can also look at the quarterbacks that have been throwing to Courtland Sutton in that span of time and put some
and a
of
lot
that
of
on
different
them
ones.
as well.
I understand that. But the rapport he had with Wilson seemed to be more solid than the rapport he had with any of Wilson's predecessors who played with Courtland Sutton, with the possible exception of 2019 when Joe Flacco and even Drew Lock
Josh Reynolds
threw the ball to Courtland Sutton, and that was
mm-hmm.
the last really big year that Sutton had, carried with it so much promise, and then he tore up his knee.
Yeah. 1,000-yard season, obviously, back in 2019. 6 touchdowns in that span. Josh Reynolds, in his career, has 19 touchdowns, 5 of them coming last year. That tied a career high, getting those passes from Jared Goff. Reynolds, by the way, going into his 9th season. So for this team, there really isn't a lot behind Sutton. And you can make the argument, and I think it can be fair. I think Sutton is a good receiver. But
he's not Devontae Adams.
Right. You can make the argument that Sutton, that's the funny thing about this whole thing. If you're the Broncos, you can make a legitimate argument that Courtland Sutton is fungible. You can replace him. You can replace him with any wide receiver in those kind of positions that's a good receiver and probably get the same numbers. If Sutton moves on, Josh Reynolds will probably be able to match at least the yardage numbers and maybe get close to the touchdown numbers if everything goes right. At least match his probably career high of 5. That's probably the Broncos' perspective. If you're Courtland Sutton, you're looking at it as, I'm one of the guys that's been through all of this. I was fourth in the league, tied for touchdowns. You absolutely need me. So this is coming to a head at some point, but it's a slow motion train wreck, Sandy, because neither side has any incentive.
Which is kind of what the Broncos have been generally for the last 8 years.
That's a fair point. But neither side has any incentive to give and a lot of incentive to hold their ground. When that happens, usually, but not always, there's a separation and the two go their separate ways. I suspect that's what will eventually happen with Courtland Sutton and the Denver Broncos. As to when, who knows? But we'll probably know a lot more in a couple weeks when mandatory minicamp starts.